Fitzy, welcome to the show, my good friend. It is great to see your face. How are you, sir?
Man, I'm good. I'm better now that I'm hanging out with you again. Like, I feel like we should have like reunited, and it feels so good playing in the background. Like,
yeah, but just not at like 5:30 in the morning. Okay.
Well, I mean, if there's any medal that Braden deserves, it's dealing with my energy that early. Because let's just be real, like I am the Energizer Bunny at 4 a.m. as much as I am at 4 p.m, and that is. In and of itself, I learned that when I got to Bristol. Not everybody's as understanding when you're trotting in at 3:45 a.m. You're like, "What's up, everybody?" Yeah, it's its own delight.
It is what I think it is personally is it's the 12th and 13th pump of vanilla caramel macchiato that you've put into the coffee.
You would
not
be
the first 10; it's the last 3.
You'll be so proud. Like I haven't had an energy drink in 2 years at this point. I've limited. I have the occasional soda, like I'm talking once every 3-4 months. Like I had to clean up because I finally realized that I was gonna rot from the inside out. Like I mean, we used to joke about it, but like the first time I did a national show with Mike Golick Jr., he looked over when I was doing the TV thing, and he's like, is that 3 sugar-free Red Bulls? And I slammed all of them right before the show. I'm like, let's go. And he's like, this is not healthy for you. And I'm like, yeah, that's probably. I realized at some point at ESPN, I looked at myself on TV and I was like, I don't think I'm well. So, I've cleaned that up. It's a delight.
Life on television will do that to anybody. That's just that's how it works. When you start studying, your jowls and your the bags, you're like, wait a second, I feel like I should do better than this, which we're going to get to in the course of this conversation is like the 4 billion jobs you've already had at ESPN. But I want to start with, and I think this is an important lesson for people that want to get into media or anything that they care about, which is you had a career. You had a career from a very young age.
You had a good career,
a great career at a very young age with something you were very passionate about. And at some point in your life, you decided you wanted to make the switch, and it's a pretty large switch. And in that, what I think is a lesson on how you got started, which is purely out of the love of basically the NFL and the Raiders. So explain to people your thought process behind launching the sports media stuff way back in the day before you and I even got together here locally in Nashville.
Yeah, I think what's funny to me, I'll never forget, busiest year when I was out with the band Perry, we'd been gone 300 days. And I came home at the end of the year and I was like, man, doing okay, paying my bills. Like I'm not making retirement money, but I'm okay on a gig that's done pretty well. And I've been gone 300 days this year. And I don't love it. And so that's when, Sonny was like, okay, what do you love? If I asked 100 of your friends what you really care about, what would the answer be? And I said, sports. Like I love sports. And she's like, well, find a way to talk about them. So the first time I ever did anything was literally a 10-minute Facebook. I popped it up, and man, I'm telling you, most nervous I've ever been in my life was popping that up because it's different and you're vulnerable and you're like, man, what if I suck at this? Right. So I put it out and I'm like, we'll see how it goes. And a bunch of my friends started commenting at the time and they're like, man, this is like sitting on a bus with you. It's all you do, talk about sports. So I stepped back from it. And I was like, man, it fed me in a way I didn't know I could be fed. And I remember so distinctly at the time, entertainment attorney, since turned manager, Rob Baker, I sat down with Rob at Frothy Monkey. And I said, I think I want to do sports talk. And he laughed and he's like, well, then do it. Like, if you've been really successful at anything, the perception is you can be successful at anything you do from there. And he's like, while you're in Nashville, a city that limits your success in the sense that, like, as a musician, everybody's got a good gig. So like, nobody thinks it's impressive. He's like, you're on a band right now that just had their 4th #1. Like, the rest of the world is going to look at it and say, you are crushing it. And he's like, so use the leverage you have from platform and start making content. And that was, I think, when he said start making content, that was the most empowering thing to me, because I looked at it, and this is what I tell media kids that ask me all the time. Like, if you want to get into media, do it, make content. And it doesn't matter if anybody listens. And Braden, you've heard this story a million times, but I remember I had an episode, I started a podcast. I want to talk to musicians about football and football players about music. And so I had an episode where I had Chef D on talking about karaoke, and Peter King came on to talk about something, and Fall Out Boy was on talking about football. And so I had all of them in one episode. And like, I had 12,000 listens the first day. And I was like, and this is like, podcasts are not this big. This is like 2015, right? Like, podcasts weren't what they are now. 12,000 was a lot. And I was like, yeah. So I felt like a boss. And the next week I was like, I don't need to guess. I'm fine. 12. I went from 12,000 to 12 listens total.
Yeah.
And I remember one of the guys on the road was making fun of me so hard because I carried my stuff with me everywhere. I went into every locker room. I made content everywhere I was. Like Keith Urban sound checking behind me. It doesn't matter. I'm screaming into a mic about the Packers, right? So like I was trying to do this thing, and they all made fun of me. They're like, you had 12 listens this week. Why are you doing? And I kept saying, it takes one. It takes one person in a position of power to hear what I do and say, that guy has talent. And that ultimately is what, like, it changed my life. It took one person hearing the podcast and saying, hey, you're actually really good at this. And that changed everything for me. So that's why I constantly tell people, like, follow your passion, but don't do it for the results. Don't do it for the numbers. Don't do it for the money. Do it hoping that you can put out something like your demo. That's the one thing that somebody hears that they're like, hell yeah, I need more of that in my life. And that worked for me.
And it's really interesting because the barrier there is not, I need to sign with a label. I need to find somebody who I can go out on tour with, or whatever your music aspiration is. It's, I can record this on my laptop and put it up for the world, and that's it. I mean, there's a lot more to it than that, but that at its heart, that's it. Did you ever feel like, did you ever feel like when you were doing the pod that you had to, were you trying to promote it, or were you trying to make it break out, or was it just rising and falling with the guests every time?
It was less for me about promotion and more about figuring out how to make it sound as pro as possible. And that's like the audio guy in me, right? Like how much, and when I got the Bam Perry gig, like so many people in Nashville, I got a CD with 17 songs on it. They said the first show's tomorrow. Like that's the way it works, right? So I listened. I knew my influences, Dan Patrick, Colin Cowherd, stuff like that, and Mike and Mike. I knew the shows that I was influenced by, so I listened to them, and I got immediately got good at what makes that show what it is. How do you incorporate that in? I timed things out, so I built a template in Pro Tools that was like, I had music come in at 12 minutes. Nobody ever taught me that the first segment of a radio show is typically 12 minutes. I just heard it enough that I was like, all right, so at about 12 minutes, music comes in. So I put together, my whole thing was like, you can't control, same as Nashville. When I moved to Nashville, I was 96 when I moved with my buddies from high school, and we were calling voicemails of record labels at the time, just singing on their voicemails, trying to get signed, right? Like, so to me, you can't control whether someone's going to hear it, but what you can control is when they hear it, do they say, holy cow, this is it. And the funny thing for me, you flash forward, the first people that ever really took interest in my podcast, just my podcast, was CBS Sports when they launched a new like they didn't have a podcast arm. I was the first football podcast that CBS Sports ever signed. And they signed me. And the day after I signed my contract for 1 year, they called me and they said, great, can you teach all of our people how you build your podcast? Because it sounds pro. And at the time, that was really difficult to do. And so that's when I realized that, hey, something I'm doing is working, because they may hate the content, but they'll come back to listen to the way it's presented over and over and over again. That's all I've worked. I figured, like, if you make great content, the rest of it will figure itself out someday. Like I'm not as smart as Clay. Like I can't figure out how to rip things apart, sell things, make things happen. Like I'm not good at showing up every day and saying, okay, how do I sell this podcast? How do I market this podcast? What's my design going to look like on like all that stuff, man? That is not what I'm good at. What I'm good at is hand me what we're going to talk about and let me do that. So from day one, it was, how do I make something that pops so that eventually when somebody at ESPN hears it, they say, we need that. Like my goal was always ESPN.
Go ahead, Steve.
Well, I was going to say, have you listened to any of those pods recently?
Not in a long time, but yeah, I mean, and it's funny because the way I broke and the lucky break I got, somebody reached out to me on Twitter when I was touring, just a guy. And we DM'd each other because he works for ESPN, or worked at the time for ESPN, and he'd gone to a Cole Swindell concert. And we had mutual friends that from the Twitter lexicon, and John McClain from the Houston Chronicle had been really huge for me. He came on my podcast once. We became big friends. He gave me his whole phone book. So McClain had introduced me to all these people. So this guy named Sean at ESPN, like we followed each other, but we didn't know each other. And he tweeted out at a Cole Swindell concert. So I DM'd him. And I was like, hey, I'd love to meet up next time I'm in Connecticut when I play a show. And he responded and said, my cousin really wants to be a musician. Would you be willing to talk to him? And my answer to that has always been yes. So like I sat down with his cousin and talked to him about the music business and my experience with it, how I made it there, air quotes, all those things. And I had no idea that Sean was in the talent department. So, 3 months later, I think it was, he sent me another DM and was like, you tweet about your podcast. if you want, I used to do podcasts for ESPN. I'll give it a listen. And I was like, hell yeah, that'd be amazing. So he sent me 3 pages of typed notes on what to do differently in my podcast. And the next week I sent him a link and said, hey, if you don't mind, take a second and check it out. He called me. It's the first time we ever talked on the phone. He called me and said, I've never had anybody take every note. And he said, I give you 3 pages of notes and you integrated every single one of them. And I'm like, well, I was a classical music kid at Juilliard growing up. Like, you don't get 2 shots. Like you make the mistake once. And so that's the way my brain's wired. But that really changed my life because Wyman was like, you're talented, but you're also coachable. And that means I see something there. And for me, to your point, like I've gone back and I've listened to him, and so much of what your habits are your habits, your styles are your styles. I still try to break some of the habits that I have from the first podcast that weren't particularly good. And I'm telling y'all, like the dirty secret we all know, I used to sit down in Pro Tools and I would edit out every breath, every opportunity for somebody to tell me that I didn't know what I was doing. I edited out, and because I needed to give myself that safety. Like it saved me listening back to the old ones. I can hear the little clips sometimes, but it saved me being able to edit because it helped me while I figured out how to edit myself naturally.
I have never edited Steve Cavendish in any way, shape, or form. He's never been edited. There's like 16 lessons you've already given us here. And I think a couple of quick ones that we don't need to linger on. But one is like, just if somebody asks for help, just give it to them. Like it's if somebody wants you to talk to their kid or talk to their friend or come speak at this or talk to that, just always do it. I think that's a great sort of way to live. But there's 2 really important and interesting inflection points for you, because we both kind of came up through SiriusXM as well, podcast and SiriusXM, which is a very different format from, I also was influenced by Dan Patrick and the way the science of radio is taught. And so I'm curious about how much of that science of radio that you started learning a little bit more formally once you start working at ESPN and locally with me. I never had any of that training until that point. How different was your podcast execution, your SiriusXM execution, which is much more like a podcast, frankly, than a radio show? How different were those 2 things from what you're doing today, talking to 900 affiliates versus the podcast and SiriusXM?
It's incredible, the difference. And I think sometimes what helps me is I didn't come up from a traditional broadcasting background. So I didn't have limitations in my mind to what you're supposed to do. And I'll shout out a mutual friend of ours, Chris Childers. I reached out to Chris because, our wives were friends, and he was on Sirius. And I was like, man, I don't even know how this works. And so he's the first person that ever showed me like the concept of a topic tree and sit down. And the funny thing is I sit down now at ESPN with production assistants and I'm like, hey, let me show you the topic tree to help you break these things out. Like, because Chris showed that to me, and a lot of kids don't know it. They're coming up in our business right now, which is kind of crazy to me. And I look back at Sirius, and the first time that Steve Cohen ever gave me a shot on SiriusXM, it was the middle of July. And he called me and said, hey, you want to handle 4 hours on the NFL Network? And I was like, yes, I'm in. And then he hung up, and I thought, oh my God, what am I going to talk about for 4 hours in the middle of July solo on the NFL? And like, it was brutal. Like I got into the office, I don't know, like my buddy Andy showed up with me because I wanted help. Like I'd never done radio like this. I didn't know how the call system worked. I didn't know anything. And like, I'm sitting there storyboarding every block, which I still do to this day. I still we have a graph we build out for a 3-hour show or a 2-hour show, and there's blocks and you write what you're going to talk about. And like, I still do some of that, but the concept of I don't have any help. And, on Sirius, you can just kind of go wherever you want. ESPN, and this is something you and I learned at 102.5, ESPN is part of the principle of broadest set of the audience. So you constantly got to ask yourself, not what I want to talk about, which I think on SiriusXM, you can get away with a little bit like, hey, this is on my mind and I'm talking about it today. At ESPN,
it's because you're already in the niche. You've already whittled the audience to college football, soccer, MMA. For your case, it was NFL.
Well, and that's and I'll speak to that quick because nothing I do is quick. But I remember the night Alex Smith was traded. I had just gotten to ESPN, and Alex Smith at the time was traded from the Chiefs to the Washington football team. So we blew up the radio show, Spain and Fitz at the time, 3 hours. We blew it up. We had guests on it. I took notes on it. I walked 2 buildings over in the same campus to host SportsCenter on Snap Chat that night. And I walked in with pages of notes. I'm like, I got everything we could possibly need. I can write all these scripts on Alex Smith. And our producer looked at me and he's like, yeah, our audience does not care. And I was like, whoa. It's the NFL. And he's like, yeah, it's just Snapchat. they don't care. And I was like, I don't think that's right. And so we led that night with a preseason NBA Lonzo Ball highlight. And I did my job, and I did exactly like I wrote the scripts to the way the producer saw it. And the next day I came in, because at the time we got SportsCenter Snap daily numbers. And I came in ready, just like peacocking out. I'm like, let's see those numbers and let's see the click through. And damn, the minute I mentioned Alex Smith, boom, everybody clicked through. And he's like, you got to remember, SportsCenter on Snapchat has 2 million viewers a day. They're 13 to 25. They're kids, and they love the NBA. They don't give a damn about the NFL. And that's real. Like, we've studied that so many times. And so the difference at ESPN is broadest set of the audience means broadest set of my audience listening to me on this platform right now for this show. And that's a much different, like, you know this, Braden, when you're doing the Saturday morning show, it's college football and gambling. Like, that's what people want. But what's weird for me is that, like, I host everything in the digital landscape that we do with the college football on it. And I don't talk about it on radio at all week, because meters show that Monday through Friday, college football fans, McAfee's talked about this, like, college football fans don't really care on sports talk radio. So, like, it's an interesting, like, that's the difference. Sirius XM or a podcast, you do whatever the hell you want to. It is your job on ESPN. And I think if FS want to be the same, it's your job at that platform to say, what does this audience really care about? That's why we talk so much about the Cowboys, because Cowboys fans listen.
There's one more, Steve, I want to follow up here with you on Fitzy about the sort of like what you do is the light turns on and I perform, and here's my talent and here's my skill. And I'm curious, like, because I've just seen you do it in person, where you just sort of like, you take a mic, you stand in front of hundreds of people, and you just can make people pay attention. And there's just people that have that and people that don't. And how much of your just pure talent, because it's not like you in the band are out there like trying to articulate blitz pressures from the outside linebacker. Like, there's not a ton of overlap there, but standing in front of 100,000 people playing a fiddle solo, as I always tell people, like, that prepares you for a spotlight that just people anywhere else in any other walk of life just haven't had. How much did that help you when it comes to grabbing a mic and just being on camera and projecting? And like, what did you learn about that experience that helped you with the other thing?
That's everything. And the similarities between the two. So when I was in a band that nobody ever heard of, that never made it, I remember the first night we were playing back-to-back nights in the same venue. And I remember the first night, it was one of my first big fiddle solos. And I had worked on for hours on this perfectly arpeggiated, like, this thing was it was a beast. And I was nervous going into the solo because I had to get all over. And I was showing off chops. And I finished what was one of the wildest solos I've ever played in my life to a smattering of applause. The next night, same venue, I have had way too much to drink, like at a level of drink, but where I should not be playing. And I realized as I'm about to go to this solo that there's not a chance in hell I can play it. My fingers and my brain are not on the same page. It's not happening. So I do what every fiddle player that's just mailing it in at that point does. I walk to the edge of the stage, I fall down on my knees, and I just Charlie Daniels it. Like, I'm just chaos. Nothing's really being played, hacking it. It is a terrible solo. Crowd goes nuts. And I never forgot that, because, like, there's a fine line between being the best musician in the room and the best showman in the room. And if you have to sacrifice one or the other, when you're playing a small club in front of a few hundred people, you can be the best musician in the world because they love that, right? When you're playing the Bluebird, you can be the smartest writer in the room because they love that. But when you're playing big arenas, you got to be big. And, that is still to this day. And Braden, you've seen this in person. Like, there are times that I turn the red light off and I'm just like, God, like, I'm exhausted, because to me, it's not just what you present. It's, can you present it at 100 miles an hour from minute one? And can you make sure, like, being in a band, when you're working with somebody, I got to know every person I'm working with, what they're good at, what they're not good at, how I can set them up to be successful, how I can bring energy to them, how I can pour myself into them to get the best first. Like, that's all on my mind. So, like, there's 10% of when I'm on air is about me and my take. And the other 90% is about the energy behind it. Is it captivating? And is it making the show better while I'm doing it? And that's the drain when you have 3 or 4 shows in a day. Like, I'm talking about sports. That's not hard, but you do sort of collapse into a ball at the end and say, good God, just give me like below deck. I need to not think for a minute and recharge. But that all comes from music.
I know you wanted to do something different, but do you miss playing?
I don't miss the music business. So that I always tell people. I mean, I still have a piano at my house. I have a wall with a couple of fiddles and a dobro and acoustic up. Like I sit and play whenever I want to, and I don't miss sitting down and writing a song that has to be 3.5 minutes, 3:15 preferably, that gets to the chorus in the first 42 seconds, and looking at it saying, like, what's Luke Bryan cutting and how can I write something for it? I don't miss that. And I don't miss having to sit down and reroute an entire week of life because you're trying to figure out how to squeeze in this one show for this one radio station because that one programming director controls whether or not you're going to go to number one in this market. I don't miss any of that. I don't miss the music business, but I'll always be a musician. It took a long time, like, all kidding aside, like I have the records behind me on the wall. I never had those till I finished playing. And when I finished playing, I was like, man, I was so in the thick of how do I get more that I didn't appreciate what I was doing at the time. I think most of us are. So one thing that I did immediately when I stopped playing was like, I'm going to get the gold records, the platinum records. I'm going to put them up on my wall, and I'm going to make sure that whatever happens in this career, I look back and say, hey, I accomplished, like I picked my out in the music business, which is rare. And I accomplished everything I wanted to other than playing Saturday Night Live. So I think, I'm proud of what I did. I just don't miss the business side.
When's the last time you played out that was not in your living room?
Oh, that's been a minute. It's probably
I might have saw it.
Yeah, I'm thinking actually a couple of right before COVID hit, Phil Vassar, who I played with for a minute, for probably 2 years. I played for Phil, 2.5 years. Phil was in Connecticut, and I'm still close with Phil and with his band leader, J-Dog, Jeff Smith. And I texted him and I was like, hey, they were doing an acoustic show, which is always just the two of them. And when I toured, I always was the third on those acoustic shows. So I was like, hey, you want a third guy on the acoustic show? So I went in having not played or sang any of those songs in probably a decade at that point. And I just stood up on stage, played the whole set with Phil. And that was right before COVID. And it was awesome. Like it was so much fun to have Phil just be like, oh, I really like at one point, because those are so relaxed shows, like he doesn't have a set list. He just turned around and he has a song called John Wayne. And he's like, I always loved listening to you play on that. We're going to play that now. And I'm like, well, let's hope I remember it. So that was a thrill. Like those are the sorts of things I like doing.
I'm really interested because you have watched the music industry take this just nosedive here over the last 2 years. I mean, it's only been in the last 6 months or so forth that a lot of people have gotten out and toured recently. Do you think to yourself, man, I am so glad I avoided that I'm not in the middle of like trying to figure out rent and or mortgage and whatever else, like all my friends in the music industry?
It is better to be lucky than good so often. I was lucky enough to get another offer when I was touring with Phil. He was starting to work less. We all knew that there might be a problem with the record label. I got offered at the time the Dierks Bentley gig. And I'll never forget, I was broke. I needed the money badly. And Dirk's band leader called and said, hey, we need a fiddle player that can also play some like flat pick acoustic bluegrass sort of stuff. And I needed the gig. And Phil, we had just opened for Dierks like 2 days before. That's why they called. He's like, we'd love to have you come out. And I turned it down. And I remember my wife at the time was like, what are you doing? Like, we need that gig. And I said, no, I'll never take a gig that I know I can't do because I'll get fired. And that's not good for where we're headed. And it's funny, the guy that took that gig, who's been in that gig ever since, and is just a great dude, opened up a seat that I ended up getting called for and getting with Easton Corbin, which put me on the same tour where I reconnected with the drummer from the band Perry, which led me to that gig. And, I say that because like I was good and I'm damn proud of what I did. But every step of that, I had to be a little bit lucky to make sure that I could keep feeding my family. And that's not lost on me. And when I got offered for the show on ESPNU that I got offered, it was, they could fire me after one Monday. And the contract was literally written. I'm always so transparent about this. I think the max I could make was $12,000 at ESPN. The max money that I was ever going to make for that contract was $12,000. The minimum I was going to make was $1,000. And if I sucked after one show, they were going to fire me. And so I went to the band Perry at the time and I said, hey, I need every Monday off for this college football show. I'll find a sub. You guys good with it? I thought we'd worked it out. Turns out we hadn't worked it out. So a couple of weeks before, they were like, yeah, we're not comfortable letting you be gone on Mondays. We really feel like we need you here, because they'd added like a show in Japan for USO or something, and they wanted me to do it. And so I was like, okay, I quit. And I quit the band with no idea. Like, I didn't have the gig with Braden. I didn't have any of that. I quit the band with an ESPN U show where I could be fired $1,000 in and no idea how I was going to pay my mortgage. And it was, I'm not kidding, like a week after that I got the call from Chris Childers and from Braden both. They were like, hey, can you come do an hour of like mock radio at 102.5? And I'm telling you, Steve, you will appreciate this. Everybody will appreciate this. It happened to be the week that the Titans were playing the Raiders in the preseason. So when we went in to do that hour of radio, I'm telling you, I sounded like the smartest asshole you've ever seen in your life, because I knew everything about the matchups of a preseason football game. So I'm sitting there with Braden and like, I'm bringing the same energy I always bring to everything. And I'm breaking down the everything you could want to know about this matchup. Like, I got lucky, right? And so as I still had a couple of shows left with the band. And as I got on the plane to the band, I got the call from the programming director saying, hey, we're going to offer you this job. And you pieced all of that together, and it was barely keeping the lights on. There was no doubt about it. We were not doing it to get rich, but I knew I needed the reps. And like, so every step of that process, I bet on myself. I did what I thought was the right thing to do for my workflow, and it paid off. And I look now and I'm like, man, not only was I lucky that Braden needed a co-host, and was I lucky that I got the opportunity with ESPN, I turned those into bigger opportunities. I worked my ass off for everything that came from that. But man, to be so lucky to be out of the music business, like my neighbor in Hendersonville's been the fiddle player for Gary Allen for years. And I love the guy. And I look around and I'm like, I can't imagine being in that situation where you have no idea when your next show's coming and how you're going to make money. And like the Gary Allens and the Chris Youngs of the world are going to be fine. They have bank accounts that are ready for this, but like everybody that works for them, all the crew people, all the musicians, like all the behind the scenes people, it's going to take a decade for people to recoup, because even if you get your job back today, what are you doing with the debt you accumulated over the last 2 years? Like, that stuff's real for drummers and bass players and lighting guys and sound guys. And like, I don't know how Nashville, the community, the actual music community digs their way out of this hole.
Yeah. Not the Music Row industrial complex, the people that prop that whole thing up is the question. It's funny you say don't take a job you think you're going to get fired from. It sounds a lot like the opposite of an SEC football coach. It sounds like every SEC football coach just takes the job in order to get the buyout money. I do want to I want to spend a little bit of time on all the digital properties that you work on with ESPN and sort of the future of how we're distributing content, consuming content, the who's doing it. But I do want to I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention your path through Nashville and with me up to that point. I learned a lot from you, not just the energy and sort of the work ethic. And there's a lot of things that I learned from you in the time spent there, but what do you remember about that year? What did you learn from that year? Because I did not need a co-host. I did not even have a show at the time. It was basically, they basically said, look, we want you to do a show. Do you have any ideas on? I was like, there's one person I'd want to work with, and I said the name. The program director said that's the person we're talking to, and I said, all right, make the phone call. And that's not that I had anything to do with it, but that's how you and I got together. What did you learn from that year? What do you remember from that year? And then I can tell you what I learned.
I really wanted you to ask, what did you learn from me? Because that would have been, I was ready for you to just go there, which would have been hysterical, by the way.
No.
I let me say, I learned there are so many memories from that year that were key for me. I remember 3 days into the show, we talked about Marcus Mariota for 3 straight days. And I remember as I was walking out the door, looking at Ryan Porth, our PD, who was brand new as a programming director at the time. And I was like, man, we've talked about Mariota for 3 days. What are we talking about tomorrow? And he said, Mariota. And that's when it hit me that like, it's different. And I think one thing that really hit me, because at the time I was doing the ESPNU college football show on Mondays, and you and I were doing Monday through Friday, right? And what really hit me working with you was that the level of preparation required to host a local show that involves the Vols is far different than the level of preparation that's required to host a national show about college football. Like, one of our NFL analysts, I won't throw him under the bus, but I saw him a few years ago, and he came to me. He's like, dude, you're covering the wrong sport. Get out of college football. Go to the NFL. And he said, the reason you go to the NFL is that you start this season at max with a dozen teams that you really need to know inside and out. By the end of the year, you've got 8 and it's clear. And you can just spend your week watching and listening to those 8. When you cover college football, You got to know everything about everybody or you will get destroyed. And I laughed at it at the time, but he's right. You know, one thing that I thought was really amazing is particularly when it was you, me, and Julian Council was producing, is I realized so quickly that I had a huge platform on ESPNU, not huge, but huge platform that I was really proud of. And I had less knowledge than you and Julian both. And there was a moment there that became such a challenge and like, okay, how do I keep up? And so I found myself reading, learning, and listening more because we were on local radio together in a college football market that required that you know the Vols through and through, but that you also know the SEC through and through. And, you know, that to me was such a huge learning process in working with two guys that not only were passionate about college football, but also passionate about like, hey, there's an entertaining way to deliver X's and O's. So I thought that was really powerful. I think local radio is such a bigger challenge than national radio. And I remember somebody that we both know that sort of coached us a lot in the beginning. I remember talking to him like 2 weeks in, and you and I had what I thought was a great show at the time. And it was Kaepernick taking a knee, and we had some really deep conversations about it. I remember getting in the car and he called and he said, "How'd you feel about the show today?" And I said, "Man, I thought it was great. We had really good conversations." And he's like, "Yeah, it wasn't great." And he said, "I'll tell you, it was a great conversation, but you didn't hit your audience because your family of stations also carries Mike and Mike." He's like, his point was, you needed to turn this conversation into a local conversation. What happens if a Titan takes a knee in this situation? How would Nashville react to it? And I never thought of that. And I think one thing that hit me about that moment in time is that you and I were together. We were so new. We were so willing to be coached. And because of it, we got a lot of coaching that I feel like that made, like, I see radio differently today because I spent that time, however brief it was, with you in a local market. Like I see the work way differently than some of my peers see the work. Like there are guys there are guys I work with that are on radio every day that will talk about the Titans that, haven't watched a single second of the Titans. And like, you can get away with that for this long, but you can only get away with that for this long. So I think that was a big part of what hit me. Like, I thought I was prepared until I worked every day with somebody that actually knew college football. And then I was like, oh my God, I've got so much work to do.
I did not need you to say all that, but I do appreciate it. I will say this. The one thing I learned outside of lots of stuff about radio and hockey and all the things that you just mentioned, I think the one thing I learned, and this is really inside baseball, but this is an inside baseball podcast, so who cares? And that is that every show that is put on the air, and you've had to deal with this at ESPN because of all the changes you've gone through. I don't know how many different jobs have you had at ESPN shows?
It feels like 18 radio shows. I've 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm on my 5th radio show in the last 3 years.
So I think one of the lessons I learned this working at Athlon with certain people. I learned this with you, with our time together. I learned this with everybody, and it took me a long time in my career to learn it. And that was, every single show that you start with someone is going to end. It's going to end at some point. And the goal, I think, is to try to enjoy the time you have while you have it. And that's true for me working with Steve on this show. That's true for me working with my former boss at Athlon on our college football podcast. That was me working with you. That was me working with the next iteration of the show. It took me a long time to learn, when you're in it, forget about where it's headed. You have to try to enjoy it. And that's one of the things I learned working with you for that year and a half, because we got to see a cup run out of the deal. Like, that was ridiculous.
Well, and you mentioned that it reminds me so much of being on a tour bus. Like, you can have this moment in time where you look around on a bus and you love everybody. Like, I'm dealing with this now. Like, I make no bones about the fact that Mike Golick Jr. is one of my closest friends in the world. And so, he's not part of the ESPN family anymore. And he's somebody that I see almost every day on campus. And he's somebody I love and look forward to working with on digital shows. He's also somebody that I enjoy going to dinner with. And so, like, you have this moment in time where you love the band that's around you. And then you wake up one day and you're like, wow, the band's totally different. So I can either live in it used to be this, or I can find the most out of it is now that. And that's easier said than done, man. Like, I think that's one of the big challenges that I've found in media. I thought it'd be more stable in relationships in the music business. And I think actually it's less stable because everybody's working on 2 or 3 year contracts. And that means every 2 or 3 years, everything's gutted and changed.
When they came to you and said, we want you to do a Snapchat show, A, did you have Snapchat on your phone? And B, how do you get your head around doing what is a completely different medium than what you'd been doing before?
I had to test for that Snapchat show probably a dozen times because Snapchat had a hand in the decisions as well. And it's the only thing, like, it's funny. My first day on ESPN radio, I connected like on national radio. I connected an hour before. I'd never done it before. I had no idea how we do the screens, nothing. And they're like, yeah, we'll just wing it. You'll be fine. My first TV show that I mentioned that I did, they handed me a rundown 5 minutes before we were live on television. And I was like, cool, what's a rundown? I've never seen this before. And the producer was like, oh my God. So in my ear, he's like, all right, you got 18 seconds before we're going to get to A32. Like, this is deep in the weeds. But I mean, I sat there with no idea what the hell I was doing. The only thing I've ever actually had to audition for, if you want to call it that, at ESPN was Snapchat. And I kept going back and back and back. And I remember calling one of my friends saying, like, what is it? Like, I don't use it. I'm a grown ass man. No, I'm not on Snapchat. And then, you know, the whole pitch to us was, can you speak in 3-second clips? Because that's how long you have on Snap to get them. So like, there's a moment of, can you be the most energetic, authentic version of yourself that's real, and in 3 seconds get somebody linked in for that entire clip? That's how long you have. That's why they kept auditioning us. But like, when you want to talk about crazy, this is what we loved about Snap when it started. We didn't even have a place to film it on campus. So like, we would have to take a camera and a couple of handheld people, and like, I'd have my scripts on my phone because I didn't have a work laptop or anything yet. And we would wait, like we were in a side SportsCenter studio, and half the time Linda Cohn would be there, like when she was on the East Coast, waiting for like her cut-ins and getting so angry at us because she'd have a break for a minute and a half. And so I'm like, and that's when I'm dropping all these F-bombs, like screaming at the TV. And I'm like, yeah, we got. I'm like, what am I doing? And she's looking up and she's like, what are you guys doing? And I'm like, I don't know, Linda. Like, it was so chaotic. But like in the beginning, and you know, I think the numbers have leveled off a little bit, but in the beginning, it was 2.5 million kids a day that watched it. And the funny thing is, like, when I go out now, if I was at the national championship in Indianapolis, 10-1, what I get recognized for above anything else I've ever done in my life combined is Snapchat. Like, there's a whole community of Snapchat bros that, like, Gary Streisky is one of our main Snapchat on SportsCenter hosts. Like, he crushes it. Like, the following he has, you can't go out in public without being bothered. And I'll never forget when Mike Golick Jr. was on the morning show and had the biggest platform of all of us. Somebody walked up, handed Mike a camera and said, can you take a picture for me? And because they wanted a picture of Gary Streisky and Trevor Scales, two people that half the world didn't even know who they were, but they were SportsCenter on Snapchat hosts. So like, it's a powerful, powerful medium, but there are still times that I come in and do it. Now I've been doing it so long, like I'm not a regular on it as much, but I was filling in recently and somebody came in, one of the production people, they were like, man, you really have a knack for this. Like, seems like you know the medium. And I'm like, I helped launch the whole thing. Like, I was one of the OGs on it. Like, I was in the original press conference. Let's go. You know, so it's funny.
I don't even know what the right question is to ask about Snapchat, because I do know that they are, to your point about like how you had to audition, they are better than almost any other platform in terms of making sure that their information is vetted, that they have, like, you know, content policies where, you know, again, I'm not trying to get into a COVID discussion. I have no desire, but like they have done a better job than almost any other social media platform of figuring out a way to sort of keep the content honest, for lack of a better term. I feel like what is the key? Like, how is it being consumed? Like, other than just watching it on your phone and having it disappear, what is it that makes it so successful?
I think Snapchat speaks to the way kids today want their information. They want quick blasts of tell me what's important and tell it to me in an interesting way. And that's just part of how everything's consumed now. You know, I'll go back to, like, you know, I'm a horror movie freak, right? They went back recently to the original Halloween, which is to me an all-timer. And they showed it to a group of kids that were all under the age of 18. And it scored at about a 3 on a scale of 1 to 10. And everybody said, it's too boring. The pace is too slow. Like, it takes too long to get to the action. That's true of SportsCenter versus SportsCenter on Snap. And that's why you look at the numbers. I mean, even today, more kids watch SportsCenter on Snapchat than people watch SportsCenter every day. And that's just true to the brand and where it's gone. And, you know, the other part of it is when you can get highlights anywhere. One of the challenges, like, okay, if you're somebody that's in an older generation, you like watching SportsCenter because that's the way you get your highlights. If you're a Snapchat kid, you can get your highlights from literally anywhere. So now it's got to be, how is this presented and why is it funny and why is it engaging? And, you know, how can we take the things that made Stuart Scott and Rich Eisen, great at their job, but do it in quick blasts. And the toughest part is that in radio, I speak in 12-minute blocks. On Snapchat, I speak in 3-second blocks. And digital live stream shows, it's somewhere in the middle. And like figuring out how to translate that constantly is a beast. But if you really want to hit, like, I'll never forget the first time I emailed Jimmy Patero, who's the head of all of ESPN. I was sitting on radio one night on Spain and Fitz at the time. It had just started. I sent him an email. I'm like, you don't know who the hell I am. And you've certainly never consumed any of my work, but you run the company and I'd love to get to know you. You know me, Braden. I'm fearless with that stuff. I get an email back like a minute later and Patero emails me back and he's like, hey, I listen to you every day because of my travel back and forth. You're the show that happens to be on when I'm coming back from LA. And he's like, B, my kids love you on Snapchat. And he's like, that's what we're looking for. People that are on multiple mediums. And like, I think that there's truth to that. You now have to be a chameleon that can talk to somebody that's 12 and talk to somebody that's 60. And that's the power of what we're trying to do for the future of sports program.
Take me through a week. What are you doing throughout the course of a week, on ESPN and all of its properties and then away from it?
So during the fall, my typical week is on Monday this year, I had Sports Nation, which is on ESPN Plus in the mornings. So I get into the office at about 5:45 in the morning. We do Sports Nation. After Sports Nation, I've got 2 or 3 phoners I have to do in a production call that I do for the Monday Night Football tailgate show that we do on digital. So then Monday night, I have to be on campus to do that tailgate show. But before the tailgate show, we do our prep meeting for Spain and Fitz because I have to go straight from the tailgate show to Spain and Fitz. So Monday and Fridays, almost the same exact schedule. I'm on campus from 5:45 in the morning till 9:15 at night. That's my standard Monday through Friday. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday during the fall, Spain and Fitz. But on Tuesday, I also have the rankings reaction show during college football season. Thursday, I have a Heisman show. So double dip on those days. Friday, I do Sports Nation. I do a show called The Kickoff that gets you set for the weekend of college football. Then Spain and Fitz at night. Saturday this year, I had 2 different college football shows. The college football show on Twitter, which we're proud of for the second straight years, the #1 ranked digital show that we had on college football. Over 1 million people a week watched it. And that was from 7 to 8. But then we also had a show called The Wrap Up from 11:30 to midnight. So because of the way we consume games, we get on campus at 11:30 a.m. So we're there from 11:30 until 1 a.m. And then Sundays are technically my day off, but Sundays are also the day that you do all of your group chats and your prep for Spain and Fitz for Monday for the football topics and also for the Monday football show. So during the fall, it goes 7 days a week, essentially. Right now I do college game day for college basketball on Saturdays. That's my big addition. But also we've started draft prep. So last year's first day of the NFL draft digitally, we had 7 million views. We had 10 million views overall for all 3 days. I host that every year. So that I learned a lot from Trey Wingo. The prep started on that in December on spreadsheets and who's going where and who to look for. And that's why I love covering college football, because boy, does it make my draft prep easier. But that's my typical.
Why exactly did you choose this point to get off of energy drinks?
Yeah,
because
it's a good question.
It seems like.
Yeah, that's the funny thing is, like, when you look at our digital platforms, everything with the college football, except for one show this year I hosted. So, and the one show I didn't host was Countdown to Game Day, because that would have required travel to game day, which would have taken me out of other shows. So like the schedule is too busy to have to travel. So I think the thing for me is, like, if you want to be relevant at ESPN or anywhere else, like, you got to be everywhere. And, if the mission statement at ESPN is to serve sports fans anytime, anywhere, that doesn't mean sitting and waiting for them to come to your front door. That means you going to them everywhere they are. So, there's a YouTube live stream audience that consumes everything I do with the football that matters to me, in the fall. But there's also Sports Nation matters to Plus. And I forgot I did SportsCenter on Snapchat 2 days a week during the fall too. And so like that hits kids, but radio hits adults. And like, radio is my passion. Like, I love having real conversations with people, getting to know people. So like, I love what I do. It's just, it's not uncommon in the fall for me to hit close to 100-hour work week for months in a row. Like, I didn't have a day off from August 20th until Christmas week.
I was going to say, you don't see the family and the dogs too often in the fall. I know you grew up NFL as your favorite sport, obviously college football sort of as an extension through your work. And you just sort of alluded to what you enjoy. Of all the different executions, to all the different ages and all the different platforms and all the different methodologies, which one do you enjoy the most?
I love college football digital shows, and I've looked at, like, I know who I am stylistically at this point. Like, I always joke that if you gave Reese or Greeny like one too many margaritas and then asked them to host a show, that's going to be kind of me. Like, it's going to be a little less professional. It's going to be a little less buttoned up. Like, I'm not going to do the ad reads as smoothly, and I'm probably going to have a little too much fun. I think that works. And for me, the NFL is my favorite sport. College football is by far my favorite sport to cover because I genuinely don't care who wins or loses. So, like, I just love great stories. And there's something about the fandom of college football that is just, it's untouchable. Like, people give a damn at a higher level, and they give a damn across the board every single day. And yeah, there are pockets. Yes, there are teams in the NFL that everybody cares about or that have huge, passionate fan bases. But there's also your fair share of Jags fans that are, a couple of them out there, and they're not particularly loud, right? So I think that the fact that every Saturday there's a real passionate reaction, a guttural reaction to what happens, that's my favorite thing to cover. And like, getting to do live react shows, like pregame shows are fun. Like, we'll do one for the Super Bowl. It's fun. But postgame, hey, this is what happened, where you can read some highlights a little bit like an idiot and then break it all down. That to me is the most fun you can have.
We have to touch on a very important part of who you are, which is your Raiders fandom. Rough year to be a Raiders fan.
Yeah.
A lot of highs and lows.
Made the playoffs.
You made the playoffs. Maybe you should have taken a knee, but what's it been like to turn something that you've watched your entire life and been a fan of into something that you talk about on a regular basis?
It's the most fun you could ever have. Like this year, I did a podcast for the Raiders a bunch, because they like having the national voice. It's maybe a little bit one step removed, but still a fan. And the fact that, like, there are people in the Raiders organization that know my name, the fact that, like, this year I got to go to the first game ever with fans in the stands. The team had me out, toured the practice facility, hung out with everybody, sitting in the studio, just shooting the what with like JT the Brick. And like, I think about how many times I've sat and listened to somebody like JT the Brick, and I hosted a panel for ESPN Plus about the tuck rule after our 30 for 30. And like, when Lincoln Kennedy connects, he's like, "What's up, man?" And I'm looking around, and like, Lincoln and Damian Woody and Sal Powell, like, they all know me and respect my work. And that stuff, like, I don't know, when I was in music and I left the band that I'd been in for years that never made it, I remember somebody asked me, "What do you want more than anything?" And I said, the one thing I want is for people to like respect my work. Like, I don't really care about fame or fortune. I care about, like, do people say, "Wow, he's a good dude and he works his ass off and he does good work." And I think what's happened through the Raiders process is like getting people in that building to realize the work that I do has been really, like, it's been incredible to walk through that stadium on the opening night and know that I had a press pass and could go anywhere I wanted and really have that level of love from the team. Obviously he's a polarizing figure now for incredibly smart reasons. And I'm never going to defend anything that John Gruden says. I thought last year at the end of the season, I got a jersey in the mail from the team that says number 20 on it, says Vegas for their inaugural year, that Gruden signed on the back to say, "Keep up the good work." And I'm like, just the fact that they thought enough of me to do that stuff, those are the moments you pull back and like, hell yeah. Like, I worried when I started doing this that it would quell some portion of my fandom. All it's done is made it bigger, louder. And I'll never forget the rest of my life being in Indianapolis for the national championship game at the hotel bar, watching the Raiders play the Chargers. And I look around and it is packed with Elle Duncan and Laura Rutledge and Jesse Palmer and like all the SEC Nation crew. And I mean, it was $1,000 bar tab. I regret that portion of it, but there was a moment where I turned around and the whole bar is chanting my name while we're jumping up and down. And there's shots being taken by everybody because they knew how much the Raiders making the playoffs means to me. That's just like, those are the moments that give you goosebumps that whatever my future ever holds, like, I'll remember that night the rest of my life. And to Braden's point earlier, those are the moments you soak in, and it happens because of my fandom.
What's hilarious is I wonder if you'd feel differently if you had to report on John Gruden. That'd be very different. That's a different side of the company.
And by the way, let's just thinly say, we'll skate on thin ice, pun intended, as I say that I learned a lot about what it's like to work for an affiliate, a flagship station working at 102.5 also. Like, I'll never forget certain people from the Preds calling in live while we were on air saying that Braden and I were being too negative. That's all I'm going to say about that. You know, but I learned some lessons.
You can say anything you want. You could say,
you're in a safe space.
Anything you want to say.
I just think instead of the title at President, maybe it should be the title of like at Sensitive. That's all I'm saying.
Wow. All right. So here, I'll spin this around because I find it the Raiders angle. To me, it was always a conscious decision, sort of how I was going to deploy my fandom on air. I sort of had a strategy about it. I didn't want the average listener to tune in, and everybody has a different strategy on this. Some people think you should never mention it. Some people go all in. You're probably a little bit more in that category. I kind of like being in the middle where I don't want someone to sort of overtly know where I went to school or who I root for or whatever, but I'm going to use it when it benefits the content to say like, hey, I'm saying this as an alumni and being critical of the AD or whatever. Like I like to use it in sort of like fits and starts. No pun intended. That was terrible. What you sort of always had it baked into your on-air personality. Like you do videos with your puppies picking games with the Raiders stuff. Like it's always been baked into who you are. And you don't see that a lot at major national media companies. I think it's cool that you have been able to kind of maintain that brand, if that makes sense.
I think that's where Greeny's a little bit of an influence, right? Like I know the Jets are a big market, but like I think Jets, I think Greeny. And when I first started at ESPN, I was real hesitant. There were a couple of bosses that were like, hey man, don't work the Raiders into every conversation. It's like, I hear you. When Gruden got hired, the bosses at the time came in and said, hey, this makes the Raiders a bigger national story. And, you know, you can lean into it. And now it's funny. We get coached every couple of weeks. We go in and have listening sessions with some of our bosses. And the night that Mayock was fired, we actually didn't lead with it, even though it happened right as we were going to air. And one of my bosses was like, you are now nationally, you are identifiable as someone that speaks to the Raiders. So when Raiders news breaks, there are people that tune to ESPN radio to hear what you say. You needed to get it in faster. And so it's kind of funny how like that has changed, but I think it took first gaining. It's a little bit like music. When I first started, they told me not to talk about music all the time. And now they're like, integrate your music more. Like, I think you have to sort of become a foundation of that people say, okay, he's here for a reason. He's got this varied experience. This is why we respect him. Then you can start to branch out from that. So over the course of the years, I think working in so many different platforms on so many shows helped me now get the ability to talk about the Raiders as much as I do. Because you're right, now it's cooked in to everything I do all the time.
We need to, trying to respect your time here. We have to get at least one thing in here. How annoying was it to work with Braden 4 hours a day?
Well, I mean, you know, there are certain people that are right, and then there's certain people that know they're right. And, you know, Braden's on whichever side of that no. I think the funniest thing about working with Braden, and if you injected truth serum into both of them, I think they would equally agree in separate quarters. I think working with Braden and Julian Council, our producer at the time, I was working with two people that I genuinely believe are more passionate about what they believe every day than I am about most things. I think there's a happy medium sometimes. But one thing that I do laugh about, and I laughed about this all the time when we were on air together, I still laugh about it. The amount of times I'll come in and I'm working with Sarah Spain, and Sarah's one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life on radio. And I'll come in and I'll be like, oh, I'm super hot on, I heard this great thing on Aaron Rodgers or whatever it's going to be like, I'm hot on this. And she'll be like, nah. I'm the type of person, like some radio co-hosts will come in and be like, well, what do you mean? Like, I'm the type to be like, okay. I think it's the songwriting background in me where I'm like, I suggested a lyric, you hate it. Cool. We'll just scrape it away and we'll keep going. Like, no skin off my back. I think what I learned from Braden though, is like, there is a happy medium because he would come in passionate a lot of times. And then Julian would come in passionate in a different way. And they're yelling at each other. And I'm sitting in the room and I'm like, I don't really care, y'all. And to a fault, this is one of the other things ingrained in my music background that changes who I am today. I am so used to walking in and having a record label head, I won't say which one, say, this song is trash. It's never getting released. Here's your new single. And then you're like, okay, that's the way this is going down. Like, so for me, when people come in and they're like, you need to talk more about the Preds. I don't always agree with that situation. I don't think that serves the broadest set of the audience, but I'm the type to be like, all right, that's what you say to do. Like I told my boss at ESPN the same thing. And Braden's heard me say this before when he was giving us critiques on what to talk about a couple of years ago. I said, I'm going to execute your game plan to the T. And that way, if the ratings suck, you get fired and I don't. Like that's always been my logic. Braden is much more passionate about well, that's a stupid idea. So I'm the quarterback that walks up to the line of scrimmage and says like, no, I'm good with anything. Braden's the one that looks over the sideline and says, we're calling what? So, that's Braden.
If it makes you feel any better, I learned a lot. And this also tied into having a child and being married all at the same time of launching the show with you.
Oh my God.
Learning to pick your battles is absolutely something I was terrible at before. I'm not exactly great at it now, but I'm better at it because I worked with you. So I'm getting crotchety and old, but whatever.
I don't think, by the way, like I'll go back to, I think one of the most pig-headed people I've ever worked with in my life is Russillo. And Russillo is also one of the best people I've like when radio was Russillo and I would be on that show. You're talking about somebody that comes in and the minute everybody walked in the room, he'd be like, what are you hot on? And you give him one sentence. He's like, yes, no, yes. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about that. Then he'd be like, we're going to do this. Everybody break. And he walks out of the room. And I'm like, but made for great radio. So like, I think as long as you believe passionately about where you are on that spectrum, like I actually have learned from you that I need to have more balls sometimes. I'm just not the best at that. Like I'm the guy that like, I'll be like, I'm pushing back on it unless you don't want me to push back, in which case it's totally fine. Like,
no, the number of times we'd be in the middle of a commercial break and Fitzy would be like, I'm just not dying on that hill, Brady. And I'd be like, oh, fine. That's probably the right approach. Like it would take me like 4 breaks to get there, but eventually I would finally get there. So
there's also this weird like fault for me, the know your worth. I work with a lot of people that will tell you, like, as you walk around the halls when they're being asked to do things they don't want to, they're like, I know my worth. I'm not going to do that. I come from such there was a drummer years ago that was touring with a huge band. And I remember him coming in and saying to all of us that were on the road, I'm going to go in and tell them if they don't double my salary, I quit. And I was like, cool. Question. How many people do you think in the amphitheater are not going to buy tickets to the next show because you're not the drummer? And if the answer to that is not many, then your value is replaceable. So just be really sure about that before you do it. That today, like, still is part of my mindset. When everybody else I work with is like, know your worth. I'm like, that's a problem. I know my worth and I'm getting way more than I deserve. So I'm just going to sit here and take a beating. Like that's the problematic approach for me.
That's what makes living in the Twitter sewers fun for me. I have no, you want to insult me on the Twitters? I'm honored. I am honored you took time out of your day to tell me how much of a moron that I am. Fitzy, thank you so much for giving us all of your time. Where's everybody going to catch you all weekend long? We have a little football game this weekend, so.
Yeah, we'll be doing a digital pregame show for the Super Bowl for an hour before the game kicks. So I think 5 to 6, and you can check that out on any of the ESPN social platforms, especially on YouTube. We get that stuff lives forever on YouTube. But if you're on Twitter, ESPN tweets it out. I tweet it out at Jason Fitz. Also on Saturday, I'll be doing Countdown to College Basketball Game Day as I do every Saturday. So, or Spain and Fitz, 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern, Monday through Friday on ESPN Radio and Sirius XM Channel 8.
There you have it. Presented by Progressive Insurance. Thank you so much, man. It's great to see you, dude. We appreciate your time today on the show. Thank you.
You guys are the best. Thanks for having me.